Okay, in this short lecture on the Chicano movement, I'm just mostly going to focus on the figures known as the four horsemen of the Chicano movement. Um, for starters, let me just kind of talk about the Chicano movement as an overview. So, up to your read now, you've seen that we basically looked at the Spanish moving into this territory, not in a really major way, specifically, through the mission system. Then Mexico inherit this territory, but really what you're having is the creation of like these rancheros, um, and then the United States moves in 1848 with the Mexican American War, and you begin to get the movement of manifest destiny moving into this territory. You blink, and now you're in the 20th century, and you're having a number of Chicanos um, try to integrate, assimilate with some struggle. Obviously, we looked at some of the racial racism that had led to this struggle, especially with the different deportation campaigns, the ones in the 1930s, and then most recently with Operation Wetback in the 1950s. So, with the era of Kennedy on the horizon, this led to this again push for integration, and that really does fit the kind of what I would call the 1950s like LULAC generation. This we call it assimilationist, but it is more about integrate into the system. And there's the textbook deals with some people who have you know rose to political prominence or even cultural prominence in the United States. Still, there's enough struggle, and that's what leads into these figures known as the Four Horsemen of the Chicano movement. They sort of personify the struggle among younger people, among the working Chicano class, who don't just want to assimilate and integrate, but they want to really um, promote and explore and celebrate this idea of Chicano culture. So it's a very this idea really develops more in the '60s. So it is definitely something that builds upon the civil rights movement that had been going on, and it wasn't a coordinated effort. So the people that we look at, it wasn't like they all got together in a back room someday and were like, "Hey, let's all hang out and like come up with this plan." That didn't really happen. In essence, what they did was, they all had their kind of concern, and then it all kind of again happened within this 1960s civil rights time period. So I think one of the problems about U.S. history is it tends to focus solely on civil rights and then kind of close the discussion with the death of MLK in '68 and the election of Nixon. The focus turning into like the Vietnam War, the death of the Kennedys, all that stuff. It kind of takes a focus. And so one of the first things I want to really come to get across is the Chicano movement is just kind of building up steam as you move into the late '60s. And in fact, as the '70s roll along, it's still operating. It's still trying to push for, changes in education and representation, etc. Right, labor issues. So that's one thing just to kind of get started to focus on. Okay. So let's look at first the first of the four horsemen, that is Cesar Chavez, and then by extension, obviously Dolores Huerta, who is still alive. Now, the thing with Chavez and Huerta, both of them will reach out to the Democratic Party. In fact, the Kennedys are very build a deep rapport with Chavez, especially after the death of Robert Kennedy. That frankly happened in California soon after the end of Chavez's 25-day fast in 1968. there's plenty of iconic pictures that come with that breaking that fast. But afterward, as I was mentioning, the push for this successful boycott against the growers in California, specifically on produce, fruit and produce. Um, the utilization of the Kennedys helped the United Farm Workers movement a lot. So, out of the four horsemen, Chavez is one who is more of an integrationist. As you'll see in reading him, you'll see him as someone who is not going to turn away anybody that is going to be there for help. And in some ways, Dolores Huerta falls through. She's been someone who's been very supportive of most of the mainstream Democratic candidates. So they are kind of iconic in both ways. Chavez tends to get a lot of the focus, as pretty much everybody's pointed out, honestly. And part of it is, I think, he fits this categorization of the Chicano Martin Luther King Jr. Because he also was inspired by Gandhi. He also practiced nonviolent resistance, and so he's a man of peace. As you're going to see in the reading, he's a man. He has a deep spirituality about him, and was not afraid to utilize it in the activism. I mean, you got to think you're dealing mostly with Latinos, so using Catholic iconography would not have been something weird, and so it was actually something that helped define the movement in a lot of ways. And the fact of not applying counter violence towards the violence that definitely the growers and their goons were using against the farm workers was something that the media and that type of narrative really fit in with, like, the Vietnam War protests, and even again Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC. So you'll be reading more about him in the book. So let me skip to the other three figures, and then hopefully we'll have time for more discussion about them when we next meet. The next figure is Reyes Lopez Tijerina. Tijerina is was a minister, very fiery orator. Some would call him the Malcolm X of the movement, because he, for all the talk about radical activism, because of stealing land from Chicanos over about 100 years, since 1848. Tijerina actually leads a shootout at the Tierra Amarilla courthouse. So a lot of people make that comment, for all the people speaking about radicalism and fighting back against government forces. Tijerina actually does that. He is a very controversial figure. There's stuff about his character I'll probably talk about more in person when we meet. But he did get enough notoriety. He does actually serve some jail time. But a lot of his notoriety of actually standing up to government forces in New Mexico. Whether he was an opportunist, that's another story. As I mentioned, he does serve some jail time for some of his problems. Famously, both he and Corky Gonzalez, the next figure, were both involved in the 1968 Poor People's March. Now, the Poor People's March was something that Martin Luther King Jr. was actually putting together, kind of a coalition of forces that would march on Washington. Now, he was shot and killed before this was put together. So it fell to Ralph Abernathy to mobilize this movement. And it kind of became a hot mess, unfortunately. It seems that the Native American groups and the Chicano groups really bonded during this time period. Whereas the African American groups led by Abernathy were not were somewhat that's the word I'm looking for, seemed to be aloof. At least that was a perception by some of these other figures. So it was a smorgasbord of different groups. It could have been something really big, honestly. Cesar Chavez was not involved, even though early on, there is a letter between King and Chavez, and Chavez was very weakened from the 25-day fast, so he did not get involved. He had his own issues with the farm workers movement in '68. So that creates a problem. Chavez is not involved, but instead the movements by Gonzalez and Tijerina were. Um, Tijerina is further to the left of Chavez, definitely somebody who has given up on the Democratic Party and actually is very much connected to creating Chicano nationalism. So the idea of nationalism really got popularized by someone like Malcolm X, where it's saying like enough, we don't really want to be part of integrate to the United States. We want to have like our own separate culture and like people basically want Chicanos to be left alone. Um, his movement is more centered in Denver, Colorado. So that's where like the Chicano Youth Liberation Front was founded. And as you already saw, the uh, the famous poem "I Am Joaquin," which Luis Valdez created the short video from. Was like the big kind of like overlapping poem narrative, Chicano mythos that connected these different movements, especially people like Tijerina and Gonzalez. The last of the figures is the La Raza Unida Party, which was founded by Jose Angel Gutierrez. And you can see in this picture there is Gutierrez, Tijerina, and Gonzalez. Um, he tried to start a party that was not the Democratic Party or obviously the Republican Party. Mostly in Texas. So Gutierrez is in Texas, Chavez is in California, Tijerina, New Mexico, and and then Gonzalez in Denver. The La Raza Unida Party is way more targeting more of a radicalized youth. Out of all this, you'll see groups like the Brown Berets be formed, so you can kind of feel like um, the movement of civil rights movement. You're seeing Chicano movement kind of mirror and take on some of um, the shifts that happened even with the civil rights movement, where as time went on, especially the younger people who are just kind of tired of the nonsense of become more radicalized. So so it was kind of a flash in the pan for Gutierrez. Honestly, the party itself doesn't get very far, and there's infighting between these three guys. So the three of them and eventually are not meeting anymore in the middle. Um, and especially between Gutierrez and Gonzalez, there's like a falling out, and so you get political fragmentation from that. The other thing is, and a quick comment on this, and then I probably have to close, is that women did feel left out. Women were very much part of the movement, and then did feel left out, generally speaking. Um, and so that's pretty sad, because they're very much part of this mobilization, but Chicanas in general felt like the men, there was a lot of machismo going on, and the men controlled the dialogue, and oftentimes they would write. The Chicanas would reflect they were basically left to make the coffee and not really have a voice in the meeting. So you'd get Chicano movements trying to respond to that. So we'll talk more about this in person next we meet. But this is just kind of a